and welcome back to a Marxist analysis of the Samantha series from American Girl. Today we're talking about book number 4, Happy Birthday, Samantha. In case this is your first time stumbling onto one of these videos, hi, I'm Sam. I have a media studies degree. I grew up in the early 2000s and am a certified American Girl kid. And I love overanalyzing media and specifically talking about politics and identity in media. In this series, I am looking at the Samantha books through the lens of Marxist literary theory. So we're talking a lot about social class, we're talking a lot about labor and about workers' rights, and today we're also going to be talking about feminism and women's suffrage because that is a big theme in this book specifically. So yeah, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, I will link them in a playlist in the description, but otherwise, let's get into it. Starting with a recap, in case you have not read this book since you were a child, we start on the morning of Samantha's 10th birthday, which, as we all know, is a very important birthday. And she is woken up by Agnes and Agatha, who have prepared this big, beautiful bouquet wrapped in lace as a birthday gift for her. And if you're sitting there thinking, Agnes and Agatha, I don't know who those people are, that's because they literally have never come up in the series before. They are brand new characters who appear for the first time in this book. And get used to them because they are central to Happy Birthday, Samantha and the next book in the series. Agnes and Agatha are Aunt Cornelia's younger sister. They are 10 and they are identical twins. And speaking of Cornelia, she and Uncle Gard are married now. They apparently got married off screen between Samantha's surprise and this book. Anyway, Agnes and Agatha wake Samantha up. They give her her birthday present. They all go downstairs and they are helping Hawkins, Grandmary's butler, get ready for Samantha's birthday party. They are going to have ice cream, and because it's 1904, they have to churn the ice cream by hand. Eddie Ryland shows up. Remember, he's Samantha's annoying next door neighbor, and she doesn't really want to let him hang out with them, but she kind of agrees to let him help with the ice cream just to shut him up. And fast forward, later in the day, it is Samantha's birthday party. She has Agnes and Agatha there. She has all of her friends from school there with her. And Gard and Cornelia show up in their car, which is very new and sexy and exciting. And they bring a new puppy with them. They have decided to adopt a dog, and they have this adorable little puppy that they bring with them. I am not going to say the puppy's name because although it is spelled differently, it sounds the same as a racial slur. But they have this beautiful new puppy whose name may or may not be super offensive. Anyway, the birthday party is ruined when everyone tastes the ice cream and realizes that it is really nasty. It has salt in it instead of sugar. And the girls quickly realize that Eddie has ruined the ice cream to ruin Samantha's birthday party as a prank, basically. But the day is saved when Agnes and Agatha invite Samantha to visit them in New York City. Chapter 3 starts with Samantha and Grandmary arriving in New York. They pass by a suffragist rally on the way to Uncle Gard and Aunt Cornelia's house. Grandmary is very stern and disapproving of this newfangled suffrage thing, which we'll talk about later. They all arrive at the townhouse, and Samantha and the twins get permission to take the puppy, whose name I will not say, on a walk. And before they leave, Aunt Cornelia talks to the girls. She says, you need to keep the puppy on his leash. You need to make sure that he's secure because as we all know, puppies are kind of tiny velociraptors. They're very out of control. And the girls are like, yes, yes, of course. As soon as they get to the park, they take that dog off his leash and put him in a little baby carriage that they have for their dolls. So, of course, the puppy immediately gets loose and leads them on a chase all through downtown New York City. There is a genuinely intense scene where the girls are chasing this dog through the streets, and Samantha has a moment of just realizing how small he is and how many things in the city could potentially hurt or kill him. There is a genuinely harrowing scene where they think the dog has been run over by a carriage. He hasn't, he's fine. And eventually they chase him right into a suffragist rally. The suffragist event that Samantha and Grandmary saw earlier is in full swing, and the dog runs right in. The girls are chasing after him, and he runs right up on stage and jumps into the arms of the keynote speaker at this suffragist event. And lo and behold, the speaker is Cornelia. Cornelia gets on to the girls. She disciplines them in a way that I think is very fair. And then they all go to meet up with Grandmary for ice cream as they had previously planned. When they get to the ice cream parlor, Grandmary reveals that she went to the suffragist rally and heard Cornelia speak. And she says that Cornelia has changed her mind about women's right to vote, and now she also thinks that women should have the vote. And the book ends on that note. So now that we've got our plot summary out of the way, let's get into my thoughts and analysis. So right off the bat, the first thing I noticed and then I thought was odd is that Nellie is not in this book at all. She's not at Samantha's birthday party. There's not even a mention of like she was invited to the party, but she had to work and couldn't make it. Samantha doesn't think about her. There is not a single mention of her. It is like she does not exist. She has completely disappeared from the series, which is weird because Nellie is a very important character in the first two books of this series. And spoiler alert, she's a very important character in the final book in the series. So it's odd how absent she is from the other half of the Samantha books. Especially in this book, it feels like Nellie is absent because Agnes and Agatha have been brought in almost to replace her. And replacing Nellie, who has kind of been the voice of the working class in this series, with these two side characters who, like Samantha, are wealthy, privileged, upper-class girls, feels like it kind of undermines some of the themes that the earlier books built up. So I just think it's a really interesting choice, and I will be honest, it's not one that I'm a fan of. I do not really care for Agnes and Agatha. I did not like them when I was a kid. I don't like them better as an adult. I think they are the type of character that Valerie Tripp loves to write. I should say, Valerie Tripp is our author for this book and will continue to be our author for the rest of the Samantha series, or at least the main books in the series. And Valerie Tripp loves to write spunky, feisty, and very bold, almost bratty girls. And that's just never been a character type that I really enjoyed. Even as a kid, I didn't like these characters. I didn't like the Molly books. I didn't like other series with that character type like Junie B. Jones. And that probably says more about me than about these characters because I was a really bookish, kind of shy, introverted kid. So maybe I just can't relate to those characters, but Agnes and Agatha definitely kind of fit the Valerie Tripp type. I do think the twins are interesting as a foil for Samantha, though, and I do like that. I like how they're used as a foil for her character. Because at this point in the series, we know that Samantha is aware and a little bit self-conscious about her class privilege. And the twins are the exact opposite. They are incredibly entitled. You know, to make Samantha's birthday bouquet, they cut up an expensive lace petticoat and they stole roses from Hawkins' special rose bush in the garden without asking permission. They have all these ideas for making Samantha's birthday better and more exciting and more like what they do in New York City. And all of those ideas are things that create a ton more work for Hawkins and Mrs. Hawkins. And it genuinely does not seem to occur to Agnes and Agatha that their actions and the things that they want might impact people outside of themselves. I think they mean well. I don't think they're bad kids, but they seem to just do whatever they want without thinking about consequences for themselves or for other people. It sounds like their mother is a very permissive parent. It sounds like she's kind of overwhelmed by having two twins. And Cornelia is like 10 years older, so it's possible that there are other siblings in between them. But it sounds like their mom is just kind of burnt out and can't really keep up with them enough to discipline them. Later in the book, we actually get hints that Cornelia is the only person who can really rein them in and discipline them, because she does sit them down and go, hey, like, what you did was wrong, and here's why. Which is interesting. Again, Cornelia seems like she might be a little bit of that parentified oldest daughter trope. And the twins are oh, hello. My son. Have a visitor. This is Basil. But the twins are only able to be like this because of their class privilege. If we think about it, they are causing absolute chaos in this home. They are making so much extra work for the servants, but Hawkins and Mrs. Hawkins and Grandmary's other servants can't discipline them or even be visibly upset by the things that they do and the problems that they cause, because that would break social etiquette. You know, these girls are their employer's family. So there's definitely a power imbalance there, and it's a power imbalance that I think Samantha is aware of, but the twins are completely oblivious to it. So moving on from the new characters, this book leans a lot harder than previous books into the tradition versus progress theme. And to talk about that theme and how it's used in this book, we need to talk a little bit about the progressive era, because these books do take place in the progressive era of American history. And specifically, this book deals a lot with progressive era politics. So, Wikipedia says that the progressive era was a period in the United States during the early 20th century of widespread social activism and political reform across the country. Key issues in this period were regulating business, protecting the natural world, and improving living conditions for working poor people. And of course, women's suffrage was also part of the progressive platform. And women's suffrage is, of course, also a big thing in Happy Birthday, Samantha. And as part of my research for this book, I actually read a book about the history of the women's suffrage movement called Votes for Women by Winifred Conkling, which I did really enjoy and I do recommend, because I had forgotten how intense the fight for women's suffrage was. And especially with this being an election year in the United States, I felt like this was a very timely read. And Boy, I'm glad that we're all going to use our right to vote to make decisions that will benefit ourselves and our descendants, right? Yeah. So, from that book, I learned that in 1904, the women's suffrage movement in the US was actually kind of slowing down. They were in the middle of a rebrand and kind of relaunching the movement after several years of losing steam and kind of slowing down, after several of the leaders' movements had died in the late 1800s. By the time Samantha is an adult, the suffrage movement will be fully back in swing, and Samantha will actually be an adult just in time for the much more radical version of women's suffrage. In the late 1900s into the early 19-teens is when we see suffragists in the US getting a lot more radical and getting a lot more aggressive with their campaigning. And that aggression and those radical tactics are what eventually got women the vote. There's a very real chance that when Samantha is an adult, she will be imprisoned without a trial and literally tortured by the United States government, because that is a thing that happened to women protesting for the vote in the 19-teens. God, y'all, we worked so hard to get the vote. Please use it. Another thing to note is that women in New York at this point in history had a lot more rights than women in other parts of the country, or they had gotten those rights earlier. Because before women were given suffrage at the national level, a lot of women's rights issues were decided by state governments. So, for example, in 1860, married women in New York were given the right to own property and to keep their own wages if they worked. Before that, married women could not own things, and any wages that they earned had to be given to their husbands. They couldn't keep the money themselves. So Grand Mary, who was born in New York in the 1850s, according to the American Girl Wiki, would never have lost her property rights when she got married, which is a big deal because that was not always true for women in the US. And something I kept thinking about as I was reading this book, and especially as I was fitting it into the larger history of women's suffrage, is how much it sucks that Jessie stops being a major character after Meet Samantha. Because excluding her from these books excludes Black experiences from the discussions of class, workers' rights, and women's rights in the series. Not having her present kind of completely writes out that Black working class perspective. And the reason that especially sucks for this book is because in real life, the women's suffrage movement was founded by abolitionists. So it was founded by people who were protesting to end slavery. But after the Civil War, leaders in the women's suffrage movement, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been abolitionists originally, opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments and were openly racist and classist. So they were opposed to Black men getting the right to vote before white women, and they said and did things that were pretty nasty. And I really hate that the Samantha books have kind of accidentally mirrored this real life exclusion of Black women from feminist spaces and from feminist narratives. So I just really would have loved to have Jessie, or at least Nellie, present in this book, because as it is, there is no working class perspective here. Having Jessie or Nellie present would have given us a look at how women besides wealthy, white, privileged women felt about this issue and what they were doing about it. And I just feel like that's a really missed opportunity not to have that added perspective here. So back to that theme of progress, On page 6 of this book, Samantha wishes for change. Her birthday wish for her 10th birthday is that there will be changes this year. And that's really interesting because until now, she hasn't really seemed unsatisfied with her life in any way. In fact, in Samantha's surprise, she seems very resistant to change. She seems to really want things to stay the way they've always been. So it almost feels a little bit contradictory for her to suddenly want all of these new things and all of these big changes now. And of course, like, kids change their mind. That's part of growing up. But I think that this scene mostly exists to set up the change, progress versus tradition and staying the same discussion. Because I can't really see any other reason for it to be there. Also, on a similar note, in chapter 2, we see Samantha and her friends kind of being suffocated by traditional party etiquette. They're all sitting around in their very beautiful dresses that are really too nice to play in. They are holding their little dolls, but they're not really doing anything with them because the dolls are too expensive to really play with. They're all being very polite and very grown up, and they're talking about the weather, and no one is having any fun at all because these are 10-year-olds. And that's not fun for them. But then the second that Guard and Cornelia arrive in their automobile, which is a very new invention at this point, suddenly the party is fun. Mostly because they also brought a puppy, and puppies and kids just match made in heaven. But it's interesting that the party that Grand Mary planned is kind of stiff and boring, and Guard and Cornelia are the ones who make it fun and exciting. I think that also kind of plays into this greater theme of tradition versus progress. There's a scene on page 27 that also sets up this debate in more detail, so I'm just going to read that really quickly. Suddenly, the cab jerked to a stop. Grand Mary and Samantha leaned forward to look out. They were stopped at the edge of a big park. The sidewalk was so crowded, people spilled out into the street. Samantha saw some women hanging large banners across the entrance to the park. One banner said, "Women, fight for your right to vote." Another banner said, "Now is the time for change." "We'll have to go another way, ma'am," the cab driver called down to Grand Mary. "These ladies seem to be blocking traffic all around Madison Square Park." "Very well, do what you think is best," Grand Mary answered. She sat back. She didn't seem to want to look at what was going on. But Samantha was fascinated. "What's happening here?" she asked Grand Mary. "Well, it appears that a group of women is having a meeting in that park," Grand Mary replied. "Who are they?" Samantha asked. "Suffragists," Grand Mary answered. "They think women should be able to vote, so they get together and make a ruckus about changing the laws." She sat up very straight. "It's all just newfangled notions." So Samantha's two maternal figures are on opposite sides of this debate. Grand Mary represents tradition, and the book sets her up as a kind of stereotypical conservative old person, which is not a characterization that I necessarily agree with, but we'll talk about that in a second. And Cornelia represents progress and the literal progressive movement. Cornelia also kind of fits this idea of the new woman, which would become a big deal later in the 19th century. I'm sorry, the 20th century, the 1900s. And there's a quote in that book I mentioned earlier, Votes for Women, that I think describes Grand Mary pretty well. It's a quote about women who opposed women's suffrage. So the quote says, "Most of these anti-women were educated, married, wealthy white women who enjoyed the privileges of their status without considering the practical problems facing poor and powerless working class women." which also applies to certain women who vote certain ways in the United States now, I would say. But anyway, Grand Mary is supposed to be very politically conservative, but that's kind of a weird choice for her because, as we talked about in my video on Samantha Learns a Lesson, Grand Mary's race and class politics are actually quite progressive for this period in US history. Also, Grand Mary listens to one speech by a suffragist, she goes to one rally, and suddenly changes her beliefs, which feels very abrupt, especially because we know that Grand Mary is very, very stubborn. So I have a theory that Grand Mary is a closet progressive. She said that she ended up at the rally by accident, but I don't buy that. I think she went on purpose because she was curious about what was going on. Especially because the women's suffrage movement in the US had been going strong since the 1840s. So literally Grand Mary's entire life, women have been campaigning for the right to vote. This is not a newfangled idea. This is something she literally would have grown up with. And it's totally possible that Grand Mary knew suffragists, that she grew up around women who believed that they should have the right to vote, or even that she identified as a suffragist when she was younger. She could have been at similar rallies in the 1860s. That totally could have happened. So that's my theory. I think Grand Mary is secretly a progressive and is just not comfortable expressing that because of her social station. And finally, I do think this series suffers from being passed around from author to author every couple of books. I'm sure there was an overarching series plan. The character of Samantha was not created by any of these authors, and I'm sure that there was a outline or a plan for the series before any of them were brought on board. But there are inconsistencies between books, especially inconsistencies in Samantha's personality, that I think are probably from different authors interpreting the character differently. Susan S. Adler's books, so the first two books in the series, were very much about class politics. Nellie was a huge part of those books. They dealt very explicitly with labor issues of the early 20th century. And then the one book by Maxine Rose Scher deals with how kids process a changing family dynamic. It's not really about politics at all. It's about Samantha and how she is affected by changes happening in her family. And then Valerie Tripp seems to deal a lot more with the idea of progress, at least in this book. So the first two Samantha books are the only books that Susan Adler ever published, at least under that name. Maxine Scher is actually primarily a travel writer, but she's also written a lot of other children's books. She doesn't seem to specialize in any one genre or any specific age range. So I wonder how she got involved in the project, if maybe she was brought on with a contract for just one book because Adler had backed out. That's just speculation on my part, but I wonder how that happened, that she only came in for the one book. And then Valerie Tripp has been very involved in the American Girl brand since the beginning. She was a close friend of the founder of the brand, Pleasant Rowland. She wrote all of Molly's main series. She wrote all of the Felicity books, all of the Josefina books, and all of the Kit books. So she is a very prolific contributor to the American Girl brand. There's not a lot of information available on why this book changed, or this series changed hands so many times, But I did find something on the American Girl wiki that said that Valerie Tripp wrote the outline for Samantha's series, but didn't originally intend to write any of Samantha's books. She was already working on the Molly series, so she had planned just to do the outline for Samantha and then hand it off to someone else. But it sounds like there were some kind of internal issues with Adler that led to Tripp taking over the series. So I would love to know what happened there, what caused that falling out. But ultimately, I do think the series suffers for it because I think it's very clear that each of these three authors had a different vision for the Samantha series and the Samantha character. But yeah, that is all of my thoughts for now. I did enjoy this book. I think I would rank it below Meet Samantha and Samantha Learns a Lesson, but above Samantha's Surprise, if I had to rank the series. But I really enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have enjoyed hearing me talk about it. I hope you will join me next time for Samantha Saves the Day, which is a truly harrowing tale of grief and loss. So we'll have a lot of fun with that one, and I will see you then. Bye!